Hello, everyone. Welcome. They're coming in. We can see their numbers. You can see the participant numbers.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Very excited to have you all with our esteemed guest, Dr. Jonathan Sarna from Brandeis. How's the weather in Massachusetts?
It suddenly got cold. You must have sent us cold air.
Hmm.
You've had a lot of rain. We've had a lot of rain. So, but
We never can get enough rain here.
well, we've had plenty, but fall has fallen in.
Fall has fallen. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, but you pay for your summers
That's why I'm suddenly in a sweater. None of us are used to this cold yet.
But you're paying for your beautiful summers with this season. Yeah, it's still beautiful.
That is true.
Okay, so we have 44 participants. Let's give them another minute.
Oh, a couple. Sometimes hard to log on to get on Zoom. It's not so easy, especially I think if other people are also trying. So,
Okay.
Thank you. So, hi, everyone. Welcome. Come on in. We're very excited for this wonderful program. Hope you watched that really fascinating documentary. Even if you didn't, it's still going to be interesting, but I'm sure most people did. I watched it immediately after you sent it to me, Jim.
It knocked me out years ago when I saw it, and I never forgot it.
Wait, what year was it made?
2011. So it's 10 years old.
It's not
Was
so
made for the 150th anniversary of the Civil War,
Oh, wow.
1861, 2011. So
Was it on PBS or something?
it certainly was shown on PBS.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
good.
it was an independent
was.
production, and but it was shown on PBS. I'm not sure that they either commissioned it or own it.
I think you got it right the first time that the producers made it and PBS picked it up and broadcast it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Somebody, that shot of the Underground Railroad trapdoor in a bema. It was great. Wasn't that the Truro Synagogue in
In Rhode Island, yeah. I think it
Newport?
was. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like we too were there.
I've been there. It's really interesting.
Okay, we have 52 people now. That's good.
Until 7:05. Just
Okay.
we're
You have a little sermonette you want to give us, Susan, about the
yes. I'll tell you
Okay.
something interesting. It's not a sermonette, but the Wilshire Boulevard Temple began during the Civil War in 1862. Is when it was the first. I mean, it was a congregation. It was called B'nai B'rith at that time, Reform in Los Angeles, and it had a different location, but that's when it started.
I had
During
no idea.
the war. And I imagine that the people who, the congregants were, I don't think Californians fought in the Civil War, did they, Jonathan? No, but they were very aware.
Oh, yeah.
And so
the
that,
telegraph line reached Los Angeles, so they could get news, but there are not so many people from California, as I understand it, who actually fought.
right.
One has to be honest and say that the action was more in San Francisco in those days
Yeah, I'm sure.
in Los Angeles. It was a much larger community. It was growing faster. It's later that the energy shifts and from to Los Angeles, and we see that enormous growth. But no one would have predicted it in 1861.
Yes, and Rabbi probably started when Rabbi Magnin came in 1915, and he was from San Francisco.
Right.
And he was, really the first powerhouse rabbi at Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And I was thinking about that because he became a rabbi 1 year after the lynching of Jacob Frank. And
Leo Frank, yeah.
Leo Frank. Yes, Leo Frank. And also that he started in 1915 and he retired in 1984 or
Yeah.
5.
Amazing. Yeah.
Imagine what he saw. And I know that he married Irving Thalberg and Norma Shearer. He did their wedding in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
So there you are.
He was.
It's 7:05. I think we should begin. And if people come in, I'm sure people will
Sure.
still join us, but we can begin. So hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Susan Nanus. Most of you know that. And I am so thrilled to be here to welcome you to this WBT Film Society special event, which is to have Dr. Jonathan Sarna speak about Jews fighting in the Civil War and surrounding the whole story of the film, Jewish Soldiers Blue and Gray. And we are watching that because of our curator, director of the Film Society, Jim Ruxin. Welcome, Jonathan. Welcome, Jim. Thank you so much, Jim, for arranging this. And Jim, do you want to say something about Jonathan and how you know him?
I wish I knew him better, but I know him through his work and through the many film appearances he has made in Jewish documentaries. Jonathan is an esteemed historian, especially of Jewish American history, and teaches at Brandeis and has a special endowed chair that he serves in. And we're very fortunate to have somebody with his background and expansive knowledge to help us deconstruct the Jewish role in the Civil War. A little bit on the format for this evening. Jonathan and I will probably speak for maybe a half an hour. We're then going to open it up from questions. We ask that if you have any questions, please start to put them in the chat. And there's a link to the chat at the bottom of your screen. Type them in. Rabbi Nanus will read them and chime in. We won't have time for everybody, although who knows, we might. I hope we do. Try and keep your questions brief. At the very end, I would like to ask people who have relatives who served in the Civil War, and I know it's 2 of them, to share their stories. That'll be interesting. And that's how we'll do it. At the end, I'll have a few minutes to talk about the Film Society and how you can participate. It's so easy. We just meet twice a month on Saturday evenings at 7:30. You see the film on your own time like you do here. And then we have a great discussion. So let's get on with the film and the
Well, first,
yes.
We have an introduction.
Oh, right.
From Rabbi Leader. So Rabbi Steve Leader and Jonathan Sarna was his professor, correct? His teacher. And Steve was very influenced by Jonathan. He couldn't be here this evening, but we pre-recorded a little welcome between Steve and Jonathan, and we're going to start with that and then go right into the rest of our program. So we begin now with this little pre-recorded welcome.
It is a great honor for me to introduce you to the Wilshire Boulevard Temple family. Dr. Sarna, you are, one of the teachers who, when I was at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, had the greatest impact on me. And I'll tell you also, you've continued to have a great impact on me because your work, particularly in American Judaism, has helped me understand myself and my own story. And I think, as a rabbi, what more could you hope to achieve for a fellow Jew than to help him or her understand themselves and understand their story? You connected a lot of dots for me. And so I want to thank you for that. I loved being your student in Cincinnati.
What's fascinating about the Civil War is that African Americans have, in our time, forcefully reminded us what that war was all about. I think there was an effort at the turn of the century to pretend that, we're all friends now, and especially with the effort to kind of reenact Jim Crow laws and re-enslave almost African Americans, the North and the South reunited. And we are being reminded that there were real issues between the North and the South, and we are, in a way, still paying the price for not fully coming to terms with that issue in the decades following the Civil War. As we know well, you can win the war and lose the peace.
Yes.
And in a way, that's what happened in the Civil War. I think World War II is very different, but in the Civil War, we did lose the peace. And in our day, there is a renewed reckoning with those issues from the middle of the 19th century. So this film could not be more relevant to contemporary Jewish life.
Nor could you, Dr. Sarna. Thank you so much. It was an honor to be with you, even for these few minutes. And I hope that everyone is challenged by this film in a way that helps us all grow and heal as Jews and as Americans. Thank you again for spending.
Okay. It's so nice to connect with you through him, Jonathan, and clearly you mean a lot to Rabbi Leader. I want to start out with a couple questions for you, and I want to start out in a place before this film began, and that is the role of Jews in founding the New World. We all know 1492 is a magical date because not only did Columbus discover America, but also the Jews were expelled from Spain and shortly thereafter from Portugal. And the Jews had been traders. Obviously, they couldn't be landowners in that time. So it was logical that they explored the New World after Columbus and extended their skill at trading. And as I understand it, from a very wonderful exhibit that was at, I think, the Jewish Historical Society in New York, the first Jewish settlers to America, that it was the traders who arrived from the Caribbean and from Brazil in the southern ports, notably New Orleans, Richmond, Charlotte, and that was the first point of entry, not the only point of entry, and that the Jewish settlement began with their business life and their skills in the sugar trade, as well as very minorly, I have to acknowledge that very few Jews, but some did participate in the slave trade of bringing Africans to the South to work as agricultural workers, as chattel slaves. And one of the questions this film raises in most of us is, how is this possible with our biblical history and the Jewish story through the ages? But I want to delve into this notion of Jewish settlers who were Sephardic Jews, because remember, they were expelled from Spain mostly, and brought Sephardic Judaism to the South and to the North eventually. Newport, Rhode Island, I think, was the first Jewish synagogue. There's also a Torah synagogue in New Orleans. But the Jews were came to this country quite early and were exposed to the tradition of slavery here. So I have a second part of that question, but Jonathan, do you want to respond to that before we go on?
The earliest Jews who come to the New World actually come to the Caribbean. Yeah. And the first Jews who come to Brazil, and there's a reason for that. When Jews are expelled from Spain, many of them make their way to Holland. And remember, Holland has fought a war against Spain. Holland is Protestant. Holland gives Jews the right, we might say, to come out of the closet, to worship. And indeed, maybe some here have been to that great synagogue, often known as the Synagogue in Amsterdam, a public synagogue. Then Holland, with the various, the Dutch Dutch, West India Company, East India Company. The Dutch go into the colony business, and that's a good business to be in. And when the Dutch conquer Brazil, they give all sorts of opportunities to Jews. They make promises. They know that unless we have merchants, this colony isn't going to make any money for the India Company. And so Jews make up a quite substantial percentage of the white settlers in Brazil. And indeed, as you say, they get involved in sugar, and which is enormously profitable, in rice and so on. But whenever you have sugar in those days, alas, you had slaves. And there's no question that in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Suriname, which for a time is a kind of Jewish self-governing area, the Jodensavan, the Jewish savannah, unique in the world in Suriname. But in Suriname, Jews have plantations, and there, alas, and we haven't been willing to tell that story, there really are a lot of engagements with slaves, rather ugly stories. Only this year, Aviva Ben-Ur has written a book about Suriname, and you can see there the interaction between Jews and African Americans, the enslavement, the mixed blood, as they would call them, that inevitably resulted from slavery, the laws about that. There really were 3 cemeteries there. Now, black, white, and mixed. The North America is a little different. Jews are expelled from Recife, Brazil, because Recife is recaptured by the Portuguese. And when Recife is recaptured in 1654, all those Jews are given, I think it's 3 months to leave. One of the rules of Jewish history is if they give you 3 months to leave, take the hint. And some of those Jews go back to Holland, but Holland has just lost the war. There are no jobs. Some of them go to Caribbean communities that are still owned by the Dutch, notably Curacao. But some of them come to the furthest reaches of the Dutch Empire in the New World, which is New Amsterdam. Of course, we know New Amsterdam is New York, but the very first Jews in North America actually were in New York, in New Amsterdam, and they're there, and of course then the British recapture it. And that's also where the first congregation, which is Shearith Israel, is established. But we do see, and you're quite right, that those are Jews who come from the Caribbean, who come to southern states. The most important are Savannah and Charleston, both of which get early Sephardic residents, citizens. The stories are different. I would get lost if we go through the stories. But it's worth remembering, because people forget it, that even in New York, people had slaves. They tended to be house slaves. You wouldn't get far with a plantation in New York, but slavery was really ubiquitous. It's only after the American Revolution that we see the northern states having been sensitized to issues of freedom and to the idea that slavery is wrong and wicked. That was a new idea in the 18th century, and a very radical one. After all, slavery is mentioned in the Bible. And how can something be wrong and wicked, said they, if it's mentioned in the Bible? Even the 10 Commandments say that on the Sabbath you rest your slave. Ergo, you're allowed to have slaves, said supporters. But in the 18th century, we begin to see anti-slavery. In the 19th century, it spreads, and in the North, slavery will be outlawed. Philadelphia, New York, Newport, the Newport community disintegrates for Jews after the revolution. But in the South, Jews do have slaves. Most of the Jews in the South are newcomers to the South in the 19th century. Yes, the early ones are Sephardic Jews. Someone has just put up Laura Liebman's new book. Laura Liebman's new book is exactly a good example, and I recommend reading it. It reads like a novel. This is a wealthy Jew from Suriname who wants to marry someone who had been a slave. They wanted to marry, and she relates. It's a detective story how she found it, how the slave is converted to Judaism, and eventually they move with a lot of money to New York, and she becomes a white person. And the family, a dark skin, but Sephardic Jews are dark. Take a look at the painting of Aaron Lopez and his wife. You can see that. And it's a quite fascinating story. A reminder that even though they thought race was all blood and whatever you had one drop, you were African American, in real life, there were people who passed into the white community. An example outside the Jewish world, some of Sally Hemings' family passed as white. In any case, very few Jews are engaged deeply in the slave trade. There are some, but the slave trade in the United States wouldn't be one whit different, even if not one Jew had come.
Jonathan, yes? I'd like to take off on that comment and talk about what the Jews shared here is what the Jews had in Europe, I believe, in that they didn't own much property. So they weren't farmers, they weren't landowners, and their need or the usefulness of slaves was limited for them. They were business people, just like the traders who first arrived. So it's not that slavery was in the Jewish DNA here. And I'd like to trace the domestic diaspora of Jews in the North and Jews in the South westward, because in this film we saw Chicago was a huge source of Jewish participation in the Union Army. How, the central question of the film is, how did Northern and Southern Jews diverge? Neither one were big in slavery ownership. An interesting figure is that there are only 4 Jewish people who own more than 50 slaves out of 11,000 slaveholders in the South. So, they didn't have big collections of slaves. They weren't farmers. They couldn't afford them. They didn't need them. So I just want to cover that diaspora west a little bit, if you could, for us.
Well,
and then we'll get into the reaction to the coming Civil War.
It's actually a wonderful question and deeply related to the history of Reform Judaism. Remember, Isaac Mayer Wise thought that the great center of America would be in Cincinnati. And that made sense because of the river trade. We created the Erie Canal. It opened in 1825. America is moving west on water, and a lot of Jewish communities are opening up around the Ohio River. I mean, and you can really trace it, Pittsburgh and many others.
Well, HUC.
But then, a new invention came along called the railroad. The railroad had all sorts of advantages over shipping, obviously, because you didn't need the water and ports and so on. The fascinating thing is, the folks in Cincinnati, for example, where Isaac Mayer Wise was, they said, railroad, that'll never take off. Water is free. Who's going to pay for tracks? And besides, we just invested a huge amount of money in the river trade. So when the heads of the railroad came and said, we'd love Cincinnati to be a major junction, the city fathers of Cincinnati wouldn't give them any advantages. So instead, they went to a rather little place, well located in the United States, called Chicago. It didn't have much, and it wouldn't take a fire, would burn the whole place down. But Chicago would give them anything they wanted. And so Chicago gives the railroad companies all sorts of advantages. And of course, Chicago becomes what Isaac Mayer Wise thought Cincinnati would be. And Chicago starts growing very rapidly. There's plenty of opportunity there. Of course, there is not slavery. There are no slaves in Illinois. There were also no slaves in Ohio, it should be noted, but that's because the first great victory of the anti-slavery people was to make sure that the Northwest Territory would not have slavery. So Kentucky has slaves, but Ohio doesn't. Abraham Lincoln famously points that out. And anyway, Chicago becomes that, and lots of Jews who tended to follow opportunity move to Illinois. People like Abraham Lincoln are going to leave Kentucky, where there were all sorts of disputes. Who owns this land? Is it Indian land? Is it some guy who fought in the Revolution? But by the time they go to Illinois, they don't have those problems. So Jews come in large numbers. Of course, once we have the gold rush, we're going to see Jews rush out to California, essentially leapfrogging much of the middle of the country, which didn't have a gold rush. A lot of those Jews are going to go by water. Some are going to go, of course, by stagecoach and by horse, solar horse. Then, by the end of the even before then, you're going to build the transcontinental railroad. I think it's already in the 1870s early, you've got it. And that's going to change everything. And then we're going to see large numbers of Jews going to the West. That was opportunity. And little known fact, by 1881, the second largest Jewish community in the United States is in San Francisco. And it models itself on New York. New York has Shearith Israel and Temple Emmanuel, so does San Francisco. And people thought, a reminder of how wrong you can be and how dangerous it is to foretell the future, that there would be one side of America would be New York, the other side San Francisco, and those would be the great centers. Of course, no sooner did San Francisco become the second largest Jewish community than East European Jews start pouring into the country in very large numbers, and that changes everything, and the East Coast resumes. But let's get back to slavery and the Civil War.
What I'd like to, I think we're at a point now where we can say, well, if they weren't heavily invested in slavery, the Jews of the North and the Jews in the South, how could they invest so differently in the Civil War? And for me, it's about assimilation, where the need to assimilate sort of trumped, excuse the expression, tradition, Jewish ethics, how they could exercise their powers of denial to not see slavery as a horrible institution. I had a realization this evening thinking about it, that in Spain, there were the Marrano Jews and the Conversos in Italy, I believe, where Jews went underground to practice their faith, but openly they pretended they were Christian. So that's a certain power of denial as well. Whatever it takes to get along, we will do to survive. And here in the North and the South, I think I would like you to carry the ball from here, is we see both sides ignoring a tradition and pursuing their self-interest or their need to be part of the community.
What I think you're saying, which is full of contemporary relevance, Jews followed in the ways of their neighbors, and sometimes following in the ways of your neighbors can get you into big trouble. Oh, everybody does it. We'll do it too. It's the custom of the place, so we'll do it. When in Rome, do as the Romans. So I think it's absolutely right. Jews came to the South, and okay, the custom in this place is you have house slaves, so they went and bought a few. And I think many Jews who came to America in lots of ways followed, as newcomers always do, the ways of their neighbors. But in the case of slavery, as you say, there were plenty of people who didn't ask the questions we wish they did. Even in the North, as you properly point out, there are plenty of Jews who are involved in making clothing for the slaves. Naturally, the slaves were clothed in rough and cheaper clothing, but it was made in the North. The cotton would be shipped from the South to the North, clothes made in the North and returned. The South didn't dirty its hands by making things. They grew them. So,
would this be like would this be like the mills of New England on the rivers there?
Mills, I mean, there are, of course, mills in New England, but also in New York. A lot of New York Jews are involved in that trade, and that's one of the reasons why, and it's different than Chicago. In New York, lots of Jews, not all, but lots of Jews, said, look, let the South have its slavery. Mm-hmm. We just want our business not to be troubled. And, the great Jewish sermon by a rabbi named Raphael, when after Abraham Lincoln is, and it's in the film, after Abraham Lincoln is elected, that's essentially what he says. That slavery is in the Bible. We shouldn't be too strict about it. He doesn't advocate slavery, and he's going to side with the Union when the war breaks out. But his sense is, let's live and let live. And it's important to remember that sounds good, and it can be very good in certain situations. But as we look back, we have trouble understanding how they said, oh, well, let's live and let live, let them have slavery, we'll send them clothes, and we'll do other things in the North. So, but there are Jews, especially young Jews. Over and over again, you find that new values and question of authority, that's the young people who see those contradictions. And if you look, there are two interesting groups that support Abraham Lincoln and oppose slavery and have Jews, and they are young people and also liberals who had fought in the 1848 revolution in Europe. Those revolutions failed. Many of those liberals came to America. They brought those values with them. They tended also to be staunchly anti-slavery and pro-Lincoln. Those are the two groups within the Jewish community that are most anti-slavery.
Could you share your take on the rabbis who were abolitionists, Einhorn and I think Heilprin, and there were a number of other Jews who were avidly anti-slavery that were very involved, cited in the film.
You had Jews who were pro-slavery, you had Jews who were anti-slavery. The most anti-slavery, or some of the most, David Einhorn is by far the most famous, and he pays the biggest price. He's in Baltimore. Baltimore is really a partially southern city, and there were many Jews and non-Jews in Baltimore who were staunchly pro-slavery. They wanted to kill Abraham Lincoln on the way to being inaugurated. There was a whole plot. And Einhorn, when his anti-slavery views become clear, he's chased out of the city, even though he was the rabbi. And actually, he never really returns. He called himself a radical reformer, and that radicalism included a political radicalism, and he is deeply committed to principles. But there are also Orthodox Jews. You mentioned Sephardic rabbi, the Sephardic rabbi of Philadelphia, Sabato Moraeus, later remembered as a founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York. But Sabato Moraeus, who had been very close to Garibaldi and other Italian liberals, is fiercely anti-slavery. His congregation mutes him, and there he's less able to speak out than Einhorn, but he is fiercely anti-slavery and pro-Lincoln. But there are other rabbis who are very different, obviously. Even Isaac Mayer Wise, who's a very great figure, but Isaac Mayer Wise, who was an opponent of Lincoln and a kind of peace Democrat, he was in general a compromiser and politician. He was in Cincinnati, he had, which is on the border, and he felt, let the South be the South and the North be the North, and let's not fight. Let's compromise. And indeed, he was known as a kind of copperhead, not a supporter of slavery, but someone we might say who was willing to acquiesce to slavery in order to prevent war. So you can find that the rabbis were divided the way the Jews were divided. It doesn't go by movement, and you can find kind of people on all sides, and of course in the South, you had rabbis who wrote prayers in honor of the Confederacy and against the Union, and it's really hair-raising stuff to read. But had they not staunchly supported the Confederacy, they would have had to leave, of course. And but I think some of them believed it. Some of them, you discover, had married in the South. They had in-laws or relatives who owned significant numbers of slaves.
I want to talk about the Union Lincoln appointee who was governor of New Orleans after the Union seized that city. And it was Order 11 or something, where he ordered all the Jews to leave the city. And the repercussions of that were felt throughout the nation, I believe. Can you share a little more than the film did
Well,
on that?
actually, it's no less than Ulysses S. Grant.
Right.
Before he's general-in-chief of the army, he's the general of the Army of the Tennessee. And in December of 1862, he issues this order against Jews as a class, violating all the rules of trade, and he orders them out of the area under his command. Now, it's actually he's not yet in New Orleans. The biggest city in Grant's territory would be Memphis, but I people interested can read my book, When General Grant Expelled the Jews. Where we see Jews expelled is in Paducah. And Paducah was a community that had a small but significant number of Jews. They were all Jewish traders, and they were called in. We have the documents, and told that they had to leave. There is an interesting question. Grant had a huge territory. Why only Paducah? And the answer to that is, I know, and depending on whether you believe in luck or whether you believe in divine providence, but no sooner had Grant issued his order, General Orders number 11, expelling Jews, than his troops were attacked. And the Confederate General Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, he cuts all the telegraph lines. And so Grant's order number 11 isn't distributed because the lines were cut. No copy had reached Washington either. And there is this tremendously heroic story of an otherwise unknown figure. You remind people that you can become a hero overnight by knowing right from wrong and knowing how to fight for Jewish rights. A haberdasher named Caesar Caskell in Paducah, he thinks it's just wrong that Jews have been expelled. He didn't immigrate to America for that. That's what they did in Europe. And since General Grant says you can't argue, Caskell says, I'm going to go to Abraham Lincoln. And he has the good sense to carry all the documents. So he goes from train to train, goes to Washington. And although he gets there on a Friday night, he goes to a senator. This is all about saving lives. And they go to see Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, knows nothing about this order. He's never seen it. But the greatness of Lincoln, when he is presented with this order, he doesn't say, well, let's have an investigation. I'll send it over and we'll get back to you. He instantly reverses the order, and we have the telegram. Some people said maybe the order is a fake. How could it be? So they write a telegram that says, if such an order has been issued, it is hereby revoked. And that's really a turning point in all of our history. Had Jews been expelled and Lincoln not revoked the order, if Lincoln said, let's wait till after the war and deal with it, the whole history of American Jewry would be different. The image of America would be different. And we'd say, just like Spain expelled Jews, Russia expelled Jews, in the 20th century, Germany expelled Jews, well, also America expelled Jews. And the difference is, in all those other places, it wasn't instantly reversed. In America, it was. And General Grant later, and this is in my book, really repents of that order. And as president, General Grant goes out of his way to appoint Jews and to demonstrate that this was a blot on his record. And he was going to spend as much time as he could proving that he was better than that order, which he said was issued in haste. It's perfectly clear it was issued in haste after it was discovered that there were some Jews smuggling. In fact, they were in cahoots with his own father. And because some Jews were caught smuggling, he thought all the Jews should suffer. That happens all too often. And Lincoln, if I can get it, I'll try and find it and read it. It's so great because Lincoln says something that we should still remember. To condemn a class, Lincoln says, is, to say the least, to wrong the good with the bad. I do not like to hear a class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners. I've always been a little sorry that Mr. Spielberg did not include that line in his film, because that line, to my mind, is as relevant today as it was when Lincoln uttered it in reversing Grant's order.
Yeah. As we begin to wind down tonight, how about we'll have room for some Q&A later, but please address Judah Benjamin, who was the vice president and the secretary of war of the, his divided allegiances and what happened to him after the war.
Okay, so Judah Benjamin, of course, is one of the few Jews who owned a lot of slaves. He had a plantation. It was only, it lasted, until some hurricane fairly recently destroyed Belshazzar. Benjamin's relatives come to Charleston, and Benjamin then moves. After the Louisiana Purchase, we see significant Jews. You mentioned earlier Judah Turo, but also we see significant movement to Louisiana, and Benjamin is part of that. And Benjamin is very gifted. He goes to Yale. He's expelled from Yale. For a long time, nobody wanted to talk about it. Stop me if this is not a subject. They're in California. Apparently, Benjamin was gay. There's a lot of evidence that Judah Benjamin was gay, and you can imagine why he was expelled, what was discovered. And but Benjamin is very gifted. He becomes an amazing lawyer, one of the highest paid lawyers in the whole of the United States, puts together an amazing record of success. He's extremely hardworking. He writes important law tomes. He makes a fortune. He also marries well. You say, why, if he's gay, did he marry? In the 19th century, gay people married, but they didn't live long with his wife. His wife spent a lot of time spending his money in other places and later settled in France. There's a new biography of Judah Benjamin, the best short biography, just come out from Yale. And Judah Benjamin then becomes a senator from Louisiana, a reminder that in parts of the South where white people were a minority, Jews were accepted as white. That's always true in an apartheid regime. It was true in South Africa. You're dead scared that the majority is going to rebel. So what's important is that Jews have white skins, and especially Jews who then married Christians, as Benjamin did, are accepted. And Louisiana had lots of them. Benjamin, as I say, is a senator, important senator from Louisiana, and he becomes a defender of slavery. Now, you may say, but he was a Jew, and it's Passover. And if you said that, the answer is there was a senator of Ohio at the time who agreed with you. And on the floor of Congress, he said of Judah Benjamin, "You are an Israelite with Egyptian principles." An amazing line. That was Senator Wade, Benjamin Wade of Ohio. And which means that people had begun to think, what's appropriate for a Jew? Anyway, Benjamin gives a very fiery, remarkable speech on the floor of the Senate that ends, "Never, never, never," meaning never will we capitulate to the North, and marches out, and then becomes a significant part of the Confederacy, and indeed is probably the highest ranking Jew in the whole world, as he becomes first Secretary of Treasury and then Secretary of State of the Confederacy. In much of the world, think Benjamin Disraeli, a Jew had to convert. That was the ticket, but not in America. Judah Benjamin never denied being a Jew. He certainly was not an observant Jew, but everybody knew he was a Jew. He never changed his name, and there's no evidence that he ever changed his religion. Judah Benjamin plays a huge role as the right-hand man of Jefferson Davis. They are very, very close. When the Civil War ends, however, Judah and everybody runs in different direction. Judah Benjamin manages to escape. I believe he used Jewish connections, that is, he had friends and so on, and he goes off, I think through Florida, and escapes. He's really the highest ranking Confederate who escapes. He makes his way to England and makes a fresh start. He's so brilliant. He studies to be a barrister, not an easy thing. He writes a law book, I think it's called Benjamin on Property, that becomes the standard book in England. He makes another huge fortune. He never returns to the United States. There are actually, for that reason, very few statues of Benjamin. And Benjamin believed that had he remained in the United States, he would have been the scapegoat for the South's defeat. Judah Benjamin burned most of his papers. So it's very hard to write a full biography. That hasn't stopped many people from trying and doing. And as I say, there's a new one, but we will never know his full role. But it was very significant, and one either laments that, as people do today, how could he have so strongly supported the Southern cause, or as an earlier generation, look what Jews can accomplish under freedom, and look how brilliant they are, and so on. And both are right. To understand Benjamin, one needs really to understand both of those aspects of Judah Benjamin.
Okay, fascinating story. I mean, it means Jews are people too, and as you said in the beginning, they were on both sides of the aisle, and still are today.
And fought one another and killed one another. And we shouldn't forget Civil War, what Civil War is. I sometimes worry about our country today with those divisions. I mean, that was, percentage-wise, the most deadly war in American history. And Jews actually were fighting Jews. In fact, sometimes relatives were on opposite sides of battles. And that's very unusual. It will happen in World War I in Europe, but it happened first. I'm not sure we should be proud of it. Happened first in the United States. But, today too, I hear and see in papers, oh, maybe we should secede, and maybe we have to fight, and so on. It's important to recognize where that can lead. And that's why I think the Civil War is relevant to our time when we see what's going on around us. Yeah.
History moves very slowly. There are many facts, but a lot of things don't change that often. What other lessons do you feel are in this story for contemporary Jews today? For me, when I first learned of this story, it was a revelation. And it's like an identity crisis for some Jews who never realized that Jews could be so divided. We see that in Israeli politics today, but I think this is a great touchstone for Jews, American Jews especially, because as you mentioned earlier, the race issue is still very much with us. And while there were instances of Jew-on-Jew antagonism, it wasn't over a race issue. And I think what we've learned today is that it wasn't really a race issue here for Jews either. It was, I'm trying to establish myself and survive. And if this is the way I'm going to do it, I have to do it, I'll do it that way.
But there is another lesson sometimes, and I often feel that lesson is as true today. It's worth asking, what will our descendants think of us? As I look, there are now Jews who oppose migration to America and are, lining up to close America's gates and keep people out, even though their own ancestors were allowed in. But I ask myself, will their grandchildren really be proud that that's what they were standing up for? And I think today, there are many in the South. There's been a real reckoning, really, where our great-grandparents, such staunch Confederates, and how did they treat the African Americans who worked with them? Now, later, after the war, there are Jews who are very proud. Oh, we would sell to African Americans, others wouldn't. We would admit them into our stores. We would give them credit. Others wouldn't. Some of that is absolutely true. But on the other hand, there also are, I think, people in the South who are deeply embarrassed at the record of their ancestors now that the value system has changed. There are plenty of synagogues that when they go back to their rules, they find, no one who has any black blood can be admitted as a member of this synagogue. And New Orleans, as you mentioned, has that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what's in their minutes. Sometimes it's worth asking, what will history say of us? We now have the distance to be able to answer that about the Civil War era.
Let me refer to another film that we had discussed some time ago. I think it was last February in Black History Month. It's called Shared Legacies. And it's about the connection between American Jews in the Civil Rights era and Martin Luther King and the vast support. There's Joachim Prince and, of course, Heschel, marched on the bridge with King. It's a fascinating history of connection with wealthy Jewish businessmen as well. And I recommend it to everybody. It's called Shared Legacies. And it's recently out. If people want to see it, they can reach out to me. It's on HiFlix, but I can refer them to that.
I would just say, since Abraham Joshua Heschel spoke at my bar mitzvah and was friendly with my father, he was lonely. We shouldn't fall into the trap of saying, oh, look, Heschel was this way. Joachim Prince was this way. All Jews were that way. We did that in the Civil War for a while. A whole generation was raised on David Einhorn, but Einhorn was not a representative figure of all Jews, nor were Heschel and Prince, and indeed, I well remember, and Susanna Heschel, his daughter, can tell you even more, how frustrated he was about some of his fellow Jews. He expected better of Jews, so it's important to see those films. It's certainly important to remind the African American community of those figures, but it's important not to imagine that they were representatives of all Jews and that all Jews marched in line behind Heschel and Prince. That wasn't true at all. And, I think a reckoning, or at least a realization that even on matters of civil rights, there were all sorts of opinions, and there were Jewish leaders who had a whole variety of different views, and certainly that's true, especially among the Southern rabbis.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much for this incredibly interesting talk. So we've heard about all of these men, Jewish men in the South and in the North. Were there any significant, influential Jewish women, either in the Union side or the Confederacy?
So it's a wonderful question, and in my book on articles I edited, Jews in the Civil War, there is a significant article on women. And let me say, first of all, in the South, the largest military hospital was actually run by a woman. I mean, she was halachically Jewish. She knew she was Jewish. She had a non-Jewish husband who was deceased. She did wonderful things. I'm sorry that I'm blanking on her name, but I'll send it to you. But I'll tell you a funny story. The U.S. in the civil rights era, I'm sorry, not the civil, in the centennial of the Civil War or something, the post office issued a stamp in her honor. They thought they were including the Jewish community, and they wrote on that stamp that she helped cure, or she fed chicken soup to some of the troops. Well, somebody complained that this was anti-Semitism, using a stereotype. And it so happens that the post office asked me to investigate. And so I dug up, she wrote an autobiography. And lo and behold, in the autobiography, she wrote she served chicken soup. And honestly, compared to leeches, chicken soup will do more for your health. But if your internal organs were destroyed, there was nothing that would save you. But she was remarkable. The administration of a huge hospital and sitting night and day with people who were essentially bleeding to death. We didn't know how to solve that problem. Was extraordinary, even though we may be sad that she was in the South and not the North, and she was a supporter of the Confederacy. But another interesting element here, we talk about the most famous woman in the 19th century, which was Rebecca Gratz. Rebecca Gratz has relatives in the North and in the South. And she is anti-slavery herself. And she's torn, and you can see it. On the one hand, this is my family, and she writes letters on both sides, and yet she has a view and is supportive of of the North. And you can really see some of the, Phoebe Pember, thank you so much. And Ruben, it's great that you're good with it. Yes, Phoebe Pember is the person I'm talking about in the who had the hospital. But Rebecca Gratz, she's a woman of quite in elderly years, and you can see that she's torn. Her politics move her one way, and her family sense another way. I will put in a plug for a woman whom I kind of added to the list of women we should think about and is not known. She wrote under the name Cora Wilburn, although her real name was Henrietta Puffermacher, which sounds a lot more Jewish. But I mention her because there you can see staunch abolitionism. She published a poem much quoted in Garrison's journal, The Slave Mother's Lament, where she kind of talks about what it meant to a slave mother. She imagines the poem, if a child is ripped from her hands and sold. And Cora Wilburn publishes various Civil War materials, most of them in magazines, and she is staunchly abolitionist. And the reason I believe is that she had lived in Venezuela, which had slavery. She knew what slavery was. Slavery in Venezuela was particularly brutal, and in sitting as she was at that time in Philadelphia, she is staunchly anti-slavery. There are other women as well that one can point to. There are women.
Excuse me.
Who
there was a woman, Ernestine Rose.
Ernestine Rose. Good. Ernestine Rose is very significant as a fighter for women's rights. She's also anti-slavery, and there was a linkage between freedom for Blacks and freedom for women that Ernestine Rose understands. And Ernestine Rose is normally remembered as kind of the brains of the women's movement in the first group of feminists whom she knew. So there are other women. There's certainly Phoebe Pember had a sister who really insulted any unionist, and actually she was jailed, which they didn't often do for women. By the way, they let her keep one slave when she was jailed. Fascinating, even the union. And because she so dishonored unionists who Union troops who had occupied her community. So, you can find among women too the same spectrum from abolitionist all the way to pro-slavery. Women were not doing, sorry to disappoint you, Rabbi, but women weren't different than men in this regard. But you're perfectly right that today we would write the history of the Civil War, including women. They didn't fight, but they played a very important role behind the scenes. And I could go on, but let's answer.
I imagine some of them must have been part of the Underground Railroad, helping Jewish women.
We don't know a lot about it. There is kind of one book that makes clear that there was Jews, a Jew named Friedman, who he and his wife, as you say, were part of the Underground Railroad. It's worth remembering, it was called the Underground Railroad because everything about it was secret.
Secret,
So
right.
it's not like you're going to find a huge archive of someone who worked on the Underground Railroad. And sometimes I think historians are led astray that, oh, we're looking for papers and it's hard to find. And, you're lucky we have some accounts. Same, by the way, is true in the Holocaust, although people say, oh, American Jews didn't do this, that, and the other. The real story, more and more, is what was done clandestinely. And it was done clandestinely because people knew our neighbors don't want Jews coming into the country. Our neighbors won't be happy if they hear we're sending money to Jews in Europe. The less said, the better. Do much and say little.
Right.
And certainly in the case of the Underground Railroad, although there is now a museum, the full story is not well known. I don't think lots of Jews were involved, just because of the nature. It was an evangelical enterprise. Too many evangelicals wanted to convert Jews. Jews were kind of nervous about evangelicals, and some of them, it's worth remembering, there are great abolitionists who say terrible things about Jews, starting with William Lloyd Garrison. And just because somebody may be right on the issue of slavery doesn't mean that they were equally tolerant of Jews, and that too is part of the story. People are complicated, and they're full of internal contradictions. As I pointed out in the Times, that was true of Jefferson, and that was true of plenty of people, Jews and non-Jews, and is still true today.
Great. Susan, do you have anything else?
I just, somebody wrote, I'll tell you who wrote it actually.
Melanie Alcove?
Well, Melanie Alcove was just saying that her great uncle fought in the Civil War, but Michael asks, he wonders if General Order 11, even set a precedent and was in any way influenced FDR's decision to intern Japanese during World War II.
The question for historians always is, can you trace the influence, or is this independent parallel development? Look, more than we realize, the custom of jailing people who are on the wrong side in your country when you go to war, you didn't need, or expelling them, exiling them, you didn't need an example of Jews 100 years earlier. I mean, look what went on in Europe on the other side in World War II. All sorts of people. Look at all, and look what happens after the war to all the Germans. I was in Romania. They invited me, and I'd never been there. And you go and you see all these palaces and other areas that were from the Saxons. The Saxons were Germans. They lived in Romania for 1,000 years, but many of them had been sympathetic to Germany. And after World War II, the fact that they had lived there for 1,000 years didn't matter. They're all expelled back to Germany. We tend to imagine that, it's America or it's Israel. Look in our own day, what's going on in Syria, and and the people who had to be either expelled or left Afghanistan, tragically in the millions. So the norms, the idea of holding people. To give you an example, although we don't much talk about it, there were several famous Jews because they had left Germany in Canada, they were interned. And the most famous was the great Emil Fackenheim, Rabbi Emil Fackenheim, one of the great philosophers of the Holocaust. He was interned for several years as an enemy alien, even though he'd been expelled from Germany. It didn't matter. He's suspect, and we gotta put him there. So the moral of this story is terrible things happen in war. I can't, I'm not sure you have to learn it from the Civil War. I think, alas, there were many, many examples and are to this day of the horrors of war. And we should be sensitive to the terrible things that are done to civilians whenever really war breaks out. I am not familiar with any direct influence. And General Orders number 11, after all, the first book on General Order number 11 is mine. FDR was long dead when I was born. So I very much doubt that he knew about it. And the whole matter really didn't get much attention for a very long time.
So our last question, as we know, Germany paid reparations and may still be paying reparations to Jews for what happened during the Holocaust. Do you have an opinion? Are you involved in any way? Are you consulted about the idea of reparations to African Americans?
So the answer really is no. We understand both sides. First of all, on one side are those who say, look how many African Americans were enslaved and in a sense are still paying the price. On the other hand, we don't know much about Black history in this country, but the majority of African Americans now in the United States actually came from other places and never were descendants of slaves at all. That doesn't mean that somebody shouldn't pay reparations for colonialism and all of the evils that it wrought in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. But it's a great mistake to imagine that all African Americans descend from slaves. Within the Black community, they are much more aware than we are of these differences. So that's kind of one issue. Obviously, there are people who say, look, the Germans didn't fight a civil war between the supporters of Jews and the opponents of Jews. The situations are not parallel at all. And indeed, a lot of Southerners will remind you that they lost everything after the Civil War. The South not only is many areas of the South are decimated by the Civil War. General Sherman famously burns wherever he goes. And the truth is, it really took 70, 80 years before the South recovered. So some of them say we paid reparations in spades. You can argue both ways.
Right.
It's not an issue that I like to get involved in. And honestly, I think that the war against the Jews in World War II is in many ways distinct from civil wars and other kinds of issues. There are a lot of bad things that happen in the world, but you have a hard time coming up with another example of a country that goes to war against some of its own citizens who have little power and who have contributed and are loyal, many of whom actually had medals for their fighting in World War I. and it, of course, didn't help them at all in the concentration camp. So there are many distinctive aspects of the Shoah, and we should be wary of glib comparisons. But World War I is, I'm sorry, the Civil War is certainly the great blot on American history. And as I said in the early film, we're still dealing with the aftermath of World War of the Civil War. And in that respect, I suppose it's true that anyone who goes to Germany knows that World War II is a live issue there in many respects. But the moral is history matters, and history casts its shadow, and we learn from history, but history also affects us. And that, I think, is a very important message.
Thank you for lifting some of that shadow and casting some light on some history of Jews during the Civil War. Is fascinating. And we were so honored to have you this evening. Would you like to close, Jim?
Just to thank you, Professor Sarna. Always a pleasure. The first time for me to talk directly with you, but we really appreciate your insights and your depth of knowledge, and the fact that you inspired Rabbi Leader to carry on with his career. Thanks so much. And thank you all for attending. Thanks to Don Levy for editing the introductory package, and for Hannah Gohl, who always is so helpful on these calls and webinars. And we look forward to seeing more participants at our film discussion series 2 Saturdays a month, and possibly more on Wednesday nights too. So thanks again, Professor Sarna.
Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thanks,
Good night.
everybody. Good
Good night,
night.
everybody. Thanks for participating.